Hi, my name is Beth Remis, and I am in the Biomimicry program at Arizona State University. And I am also a facilitator of sustainable activism workshops. So if you were wondering how those two fit together, stick around to the end of this presentation to find out. So when I said I was part of the biomimicry program, if you were like, bio what? You are not alone. That is often the reaction that I receive. And I have found that the definition that is most helpful for people is that biomimicry is innovation inspired by nature. And that kind of gets people interested. So what does that mean? What are you actually going to be working on? And so I explained that the goal of biomimicry is to create products, processes, practices, and policies that are well adapted to life on Earth over the long haul. So today I'm going to be talking with you about life's principles and specifically feedback loops, which is part of the be locally attuned and responsive life's principles. And just tell you a little bit about what those are. Life's principles are design lessons from nature. So life has been around for 3.8 billion years and has had a lot of time to work on their research and development. So this is a set of strategies that have worked, and they're the overarching patterns that are found amongst the species surviving and thriving on Earth. So today we are talking about using feedback loops. And feedback loops engage in cyclic information flows to modify a reaction appropriately. And there's actually a lot of ways to explain this. I picked it because it is such an interesting principle that illustrates our interdependence. It's also referred to as mutual causality, which is kind of a fancy way of saying what happens affects what happens next. So feedback loops exist to maintain homeostasis, which is stability in a system. And this is not to say that the Earth is a stable, unchanging system. In fact, it is quite the opposite, as it's always in a state of dynamic equilibrium. It maintains an ecological and chemical balance despite being in a constant state of change, much as our bodies maintain homeostasis despite being in a constant state of flux. So just a really quick example of that is when our temperature rises, oftentimes we perspire in order to cool down. So one of the trickiest things I think about understanding feedback loops is understanding what is a positive feedback loop and what's a negative feedback loop. And we get hung up a lot on the words positive and negative because generally our association is that positive is good and negative is bad. But in the context of systems and feedback loops, that's not necessarily the case. So a positive feedback loop amplifies change, and often it can destabilize a system, whereas a negative feedback loop just diminishes or counteracts changes, and it generally stabilizes a system. So a few ways I heard it explained to me that made sense were if you are going for a medical test, because you feel like maybe something's not right in your body and you get a positive result, that's not necessarily a good thing. It's showing that something is not in balance, not functioning properly. So that's kind of an example of where we don't want to hear positive. And a negative result is actually something you'd want to hear. Now, in terms of like at work, yeah, we want to get positive feedback from our employers or fellow employees and even our partners. But the reason, think about that positive feedback is given so that behavior continues. And one more example that I heard again that just kind of helped me visualize it is to think of positive feedback loop as if you're riding a bicycle and you have to turn into the curve, and so you're kind of at a tilt. That's positive feedback. And then what pulls you back up upright into balance so you don't skid out is a negative feedback loop. So I hope those things, help you understand that difference a little bit. And in nature, I'm just going to give you this quick example and then move on to one of my favorite examples of feedback loops. So a positive feedback loop that we are in right now is warming temperatures. So as temperatures warm, the sea ice that's normally reflective melts, the ocean becomes more of a carbon sink, it absorbs more heat and carbon, warming everything. Temperatures continue to warm, which causes more ice melting and more warming. So you can see how that trajectory even though here it's kind of a spiral, it just keeps going on. It's amplifying that change. And a negative feedback loop in this system would be trees. Trees would be part of that negative feedback cycle that would help to absorb more of that carbon and take it out and help with the warming, so cooling it down, and so that maybe there isn't as ice melt. So that is something that could help bring that system back into balance. And again, this is one of my favorite reasons, and probably the reason that I picked this life's principle is I really love the story of the wolves in Yellowstone Park. So feedback loops are often found in food webs because we really see that interdependence and that connection of relationships. So the gray wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1995. And the gray wolf is an apex predator at the top of the food chain. And when they were reintroduced, there was a trophic cascade throughout the entire ecosystem. When the wolf was taken out, the elk didn't have any natural predators. So they went to town on all vegetation. They weren't worried about who was going to be stalking them. So they ate everything. And you can see here in that picture, and kind of a picture of the changes over time. So 1997, the vegetation was pretty low. And this happened a lot also on the river, the sides of the river. And so their big, heavy hooves tore up a lot of the roots and trees and shrubs. And as a result, there was a lot of erosion there on those riverbanks, which affected the beavers. There were no trees to log right near there to build dams. Again, with more of that vegetation gone, those little animals didn't have a place to hide and were easy prey for the coyotes, and also less birds because there weren't as many places to nest. But when the wolves were introduced, they started to prey on the elk, who then moved back away from those stream and river beds. And it just started to put the whole ecosystem back in balance. So it's a really interesting study, again, of our interdependence and how one piece of the system can have such a wide impact. And so after this study, they said that the wolves were a keystone species. And the keystone species is a species that is especially important in an ecosystem on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend. So that if that species were removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. And this is where I'm getting into that activism piece a little bit. So Lila June is a Dene artist, activist, and scholar, and she invites humans to reclaim our role as a keystone species. She says, what we're finding and what European scientists are finally figuring out is that human beings are meant to be a keystone species. And a keystone species is a species that if you take it out, the whole thing unravels. So we as human beings are trying to bring the human being back into that role of keystone species, where our presence on the land nourishes the land. We're not just going to sustain ourselves. That's a low standard. I'm going for enhanceability, the ability to enhance wherever I walk, the ability to make it better than when I found it. And I have to say that is what drew me to study biomimicry and life's principles, because I want to reclaim that role as keystone species. And how this ties back into the feedback loops that we were talking about is that a system is able to adapt because its feedback loop is open, so that it is able to take in information and then connect that perception to the appropriate action. And so as we slow down and we listen to what is truly happening within ourselves and within our world, paying attention to our own feedback loops, what we're feeling, both internally and as our reaction to things in the outside world, we will recognize our interdependence and we will start to unlock our response systems. And as we respond to what needs attention in this world, we, as part of this earth, will function as a part of a planetary immune system, and an idea that was formed by environmentalist Paul Hawken. But isn't that so powerful, the idea that we are part of the Earth's planetary immune system? And if we do that, we could earn our place as a keystone species. Thank you for joining me today.